Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. Today, a political earthquake in Israel. The Prime Minister and Foreign Minister agreed to dissolve the Israeli parliament, leading to a fifth round of elections in 3 years. Could it mean the return of former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? After a weekend of deadly shootings,
police responded to numerous reports of people shot at East 139th Street and Fifth Avenue.
Lawmakers in Washington are trying to work out a compromise on guns, but many grassroots Republicans still have concerns. With a record number of migrants being detained at the southern border and a potential surge expected, faith-based shelters are increasing preparations to meet this extra demand.
We give them a hot meal, we give them clothes, hygiene.
We'll show you the tremendous cooperation between Border Patrol and local ministries. And a visit by a bear, not out in the woods, but in a neighborhood in Naples, Florida. Those stories and more today on CBN NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin in Israel, where Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid announced in a joint statement Monday they are dissolving the Israeli parliament, Knesset, putting an end to their struggling coalition government. And as CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reports, that brings the country to its fifth national election in 3.5 years.
The announcement on national television preempted a Knesset vote on Wednesday that was likely to bring down the government anyway.
My friend, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, and I decided to work together to dissolve the Knesset and to set to hold elections at an agreed time, at the same time transferring the power in an orderly manner and ensuring the national interest of the State of Israel.
Over the last month, the coalition destabilized by the withdrawal of coalition members. Bennett said he had fought hard to maintain the coalition.
In recent weeks, we have done everything that could be done to preserve this government, which in our eyes, its continued existence is in the national interest.
The decision transfers power to Lapid, who becomes prime minister and remains foreign minister during the transition. Elections are scheduled for October 25th. Lapid commended Bennett for putting the country's interests ahead of his own.
Even if we're going to elections in a few months, our challenges as a state cannot wait. We must address the high cost of living, manage the struggle against Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and face the forces that threaten to make Israel an undemocratic state.
The government was the most diversified in Israel's history, uniting 8 parties, not only from the left and right, but for the first time, including an Arab Islamist party. Defense Minister Benny Gantz tweeted, "Tonight, we are unfortunately closing a chapter on the government of change, a government who in a year of its activity has done a lot for Israeli society, its security, and its resilience, and will continue to operate during the transition period." Opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu, who stands to gain the most, took the credit for the fall of the government.
This is an evening of great news for the citizens of Israel. After a determined struggle of the opposition in the Knesset and great suffering of the public in Israel, it is clear to everyone that the most failing government in the history of the country has ended its way.
Netanyahu charged that the government was dependent on a party that supported terrorists and vowed not to sit in a government with the Islamist party of Mansour Abbas.
My friends and I will form a broad national government headed by the Likud, a government that will lower taxes, that will lower prices, will lead Israel to tremendous achievements, including expanding the circle of peace as we have already done. And above all, a government that will return the national pride to the citizens of Israel so that you can walk the streets with your head held high.
The next few months are likely to be turbulent, including the visit of U.S. President Joe Biden next month, the continuing threats from Iran, and perhaps the biggest political reshuffle in Israel's history, something that may have never seen.
Chris, what happened? Why cannot the Israelis keep a government together?
Well, it's a great question, Mark. Considering this might be the 5th election in 3.5 years, I think the main thing, Mark, is the fact that this government was based on one thing alone, or the main thing that kept them all together, at least for this year, is the fact that they didn't want Benjamin Netanyahu in power. There were many ideological differences. You had people on the far right. You had the Islamist party, Ra'am, and I think it was just too much to keep that together for this amount of time. And the defections and what happened, what really sunk the government, Mark, was the fact that 3 coalition members from Naphtali Bennett's own party, the prime minister. They had to leave the party because they felt he had gone too far from his original promises and his ideological base. And so right now you have the prospect of it could be the 5th election in 3.5 years.
Chris, what happens between now and the next election?
Well, a lot of things could happen, Mark. The first thing that could happen, believe it or not, is Benjamin Netanyahu may have enough time to form his own coalition government within the current Knesset. If he's able to get, 2, 3, or 4 defectors to come over to the opposition, that would put him over the 60, 61 threshold that he needs to form a government. And he may actually prefer that, even though right now the poll's saying that Likud would actually gain seats. He might still fall just shy of that 61 majority that he needs. So that's going to happen possibly in the next few days. If it doesn't, then they're going to go to new elections, and you'll probably see the greatest political reshuffle in a long time. Many of these parties are going to be scrambling for positions. For example, the Yamina party by Naphtali Bennett, he may not even get into the next Knesset. That's several other parties. So we're going to see what happens in the next few days. And the next few months, it's going to be quite something here politically.
Could Netanyahu end up as the next prime minister? Yeah,
he could. Just like I said in this particular scenario, that if he's able to get some defectors that come over, and there's a risk and a danger for anyone going to elections. Many of these politicians realize if they do go to elections, they may not be in the next government. They may not be even in the next Knesset. Some of these people have ministerial positions right now. So there could be a lot of scrambling going on. If there's enough people that come over to Netanyahu, then he could be the next prime minister. And that would be ironic, if Netanyahu in the next couple of weeks greets President Biden when he comes here for his 2-day visit.
Will Israel's enemies, Chris, the Palestinians, the Iranians, and their proxies, will they try to take advantage of this?
Well, you would think so. I talked to someone this morning about that really monitors the Palestinian media. They haven't really come out yet, and typically when they do, they say this is regardless of what Israeli government, it's an occupational government. But they would hope that even as a caretaker government, the Yair Lapid, if he does become prime minister, that he could grant them some status perhaps here in Jerusalem, like they have been asking for. On the Iranian front, it looks like this government has actually been pretty strong against them. And Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz actually just announced yesterday that there is now an air defense regional cooperation led by the United States, and it already has thwarted some Iranian attacks. So on the Iranian front, it looks like they may be able to hold the line there. So but still, even in this fragile political situation, you have to be careful and you have to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem, especially at this time.
All right, our CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell from Jerusalem. Thanks as always, Chris.
Thanks, Mark.
On the heels of a shooting this weekend at a music festival in Washington celebrating Juneteenth, a framework over gun reform is hanging over the halls of Congress. Now lawmakers are set to iron out the details of a new gun reform deal this week, even as Republicans and Democrats return from a holiday weekend that saw deadly gun violence around the country. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka has the story from Washington.
A Juneteenth celebration here at 14th and U Street in Washington, D.C. ended in tragedy on Sunday night. A teenager was shot and killed and others injured.
Right before the shooting occurred, our officers recovered a firearm, an illegal firearm, right here in the 1400 block of U Street. And shortly before I walked down here, our officers recovered another illegal firearm down in the 1400 block of T Street and was chasing another person with a legal firearm in the area. So, I mean, I think, there's a theme that you see here. Illegal firearms in the hands of people who should not have them make events like this unsafe for people who just want to enjoy the beautiful weather.
The chaos erupting at what police call an unpermitted event called Mochella celebrating Juneteenth. The result, a 15-year-old killed, a D.C. police officer, and 2 other adults wounded.
Police responded to numerous reports of people shot at East 139th Street and 5th Avenue.
In New York, 9 people were shot and 1 killed in a mass shooting in Harlem. These deadly shootings are just the latest in a string that started with a church shooting in Alabama Thursday. 3 senior citizens died there.
Gunshots rang out. I didn't realize it was gunshots. And a lot of people dive for the floor. I dived for the floor, and when I got down there, I realized that two of my girlfriends who had been sitting at the table with me had been hit.
In the background of this ongoing violence, negotiations continue on Capitol Hill, trying to make progress on gun reforms. Texas Senator John Cornyn took the lead on negotiations for Republicans, but he was met with boos in his home state at the Texas Republican Convention. Still, he tried to make the case for the bipartisan deal.
So you might ask, what is on the table? More mental health resources, more support for our schools, and making sure that violent criminals and the mentally ill cannot buy a firearm. That primarily means enforcing current law.
President Joe Biden said over the weekend he's ready for a bill to hit his desk.
I am happy with progress. I'm prepared to sign it, and I'm ready to go.
That bill is not written yet, but a deal was reportedly being worked on all weekend. Some of those hang-ups include funding for states to implement red flag laws and something called the boyfriend loophole, which prohibits a domestic abuser from being able to buy a gun. It will be very tough to get the bill into writing and passed before Congress goes on the 4th of July holiday break next week. In Washington, D.C., Matt Gelka, CBN News.
Coming up, tens of thousands of migrants are flooding across our southern border, and each one has a difficult and different story. We'll introduce you to the volunteers who are helping them survive when we come back. Welcome back to NewsWatch. Record high numbers of immigrants are being detained at our southern border this year, and a bigger surge is expected if the Biden administration succeeds in canceling a public health order sending them back. Faith-based shelters are increasing preparations to meet this extra demand. Heather Sells brings us the story from El Paso on the vital role these ministries play.
These are the early morning sights and sounds from the kitchen at this Baptist migrant shelter. The beginning of a busy day as some 60 parents and children need breakfast, plus a ride to the airport or bus station.
We give them a hot meal, we give them clothes, hygiene.
Pastor Kelly Knott oversees the ministry.
They're coming from Haiti, Chile, Brazil, Turkey.
A true melting pot is overflowing at the El Paso border these days, with authorities apprehending tens of thousands of migrants each month. Local churches and ministries are stepping up. El Paso churches and other faith-based groups host migrants at 14 sites, and they are hoping to open more in anticipation of greater numbers in the months ahead.
We are now seeing a ramp up of the number of families.
Ruben Garcia has been receiving migrants for over 4 decades at Annunciation House, one of the leading faith-based shelters on the border. He has watched numbers rise this year as countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba refuse to take back those the U.S. expels. And the Biden administration allows more with safety and persecution fears to cross over.
We're seeing those nationalities that cannot be expelled increasing. And so, like today, where immigration is releasing 470 refugees to us.
Garcia is motivated by his faith, and specifically God's love for the poor.
The God of creation identifies first and foremost with the least among us. So, if we want to discover our own holiness, if we want to discover a depth of life, a sense of purpose, then we need to place ourselves among those that God identifies with first and foremost.
Garcia organizes hospitality sites for migrants just released from immigration processing. He has created the network of local shelters, calling on churches like Pastor Kelly's to provide cots, food, showers, and transportation. More than 80 Baptist churches support this location. Pastor Kelly says serving migrants paves the way for the sharing of the gospel.
At the end of the day, I think that's what it's all about. Really, no one really cares how much we know, but how much we care.
Martha Lay is one volunteer serving in this small army.
As a Christian, I think that we need to be helping our brothers and sisters.
Lay helps provide fresh clothes and listens to the travelers' stories of hunger, violence back home, and desperate journeys, like one dad who carried his disabled daughter over a desert mountain.
He said they had to climb up, and so it was very narrow, and they had to carry the little girl, and he said he almost fell.
Along the U.S.-Mexico border, these shelters showcase tremendous cooperation between Border Patrol and local ministries. El Paso-based migration advocate Dylan Corbett says it's one of the untold stories that could pave the way for more permanent solutions.
This is a community where a lot of people are Border Patrol agents. This is a community where a lot of people work for immigration enforcement. And we know that we have to find solutions. And so we work them out at the local level. That's what gives me hope. That's what gives me confidence that one day we'll get to some real reform in Washington, D.C.
For now, Garcia watches border trends and numbers climbing as he pursues a mission to open more shelters in other cities.
I'm hoping that church communities in both Denver and Dallas are listening.
The goal, prevent a backlog of migrants unable to find flights and bus rides out of El Paso. At Pastor Kelly's shelter, hope is in the air as these migrants board a church van bound for the airport.
This is just one of the stops on their journey from wherever they're coming from. But we want to make sure that when they stop here with us, especially on this border town in El Paso, Texas, in the United States, they see the love of God.
Reporting in El Paso, Heather Sells, CBN News.
Still ahead, CBN medical reporter Lori Johnson talks to an expert about the reality of mental health issues in the church. We're going to hear why it's important to deal with them honestly and not live in denial right after this. Thanks for staying with NewsWatch. We've been telling you about the disastrous toll the coronavirus pandemic has taken on our nation's mental health. Depression, anxiety, and suicide are just some of the conditions that have skyrocketed in the last couple of years. The church is no exception. This week, CBN's Healthy Living program takes a look at mental health problems in the church. Medical reporter Lori Johnson spoke to an ordained minister who's also the president-elect of the American Psychological Association and who's behind an effort to erase the all-too-common false idea that good Christians don't have problems.
I think it goes along with that prosperity gospel that if you love God, you'll be wealthy. If you love God, you'll be happy every day. And it just is not true and is not reflective of what we know from the Bible. And so we see despair among the prophets. We see despair and anxiety and insecurity with the disciples. We see the grief of Jesus and the Garden of Gethsemane. And when we really look at the text, it gives us permission to not only honor the sacredness of our lives, but our humanity. And so as Christians, we don't want to operate in denial. We know that truth sets us free. And so we want to be honest about our moments of grief, of depression, of frustration, of fatigue. All of that is a part of our journey.
Well, you really pinpointed something that I wanted to talk to you about, which is denial. You know, a lot of people within the church feel that if you talk about something, then that gives it power. So they don't want to even say the word depression. They don't want to say the word anxiety. They don't want to say the word suicide. And, you know, talk about sexual trauma and abuse. People don't even want to give that power by talking about it. What are your thoughts about that?
The reality is actually the opposite. The things that we cannot name, we can never overcome. If we don't acknowledge the mountain, how in the world are we going to deal with the mountain? And so our denial does not save us. It just allows it to grow. We can think about the physical example of cancer. That cancer can grow in the body, and one of the keys around survival is early detection. And I would say the same is the case in terms of mental health. If you have a child or an adolescent who is struggling and you silence them with scripture, it doesn't mean that now they're no longer depressed. It means that now it has gone underground and it's there growing and without support and without relief. So we want to really shift the narrative that it's not when we speak it that makes it a reality. It is that when we are silent, we give it power and strength to overtake us and to overtake our loved ones. So in naming it and seeing it, we can be empowered and not fearful to actually address it.
And you can learn more about this subject and see the entire interview on Healthy Living with Lori Johnson tonight at 8:30 Eastern on the CBN News Channel or on the CBN News app. Coming up, imagine taking a drive down the street and seeing this. We'll tell you about this bear's visit to a neighborhood in Naples, Florida, when we come back. Stay with us. Finally today, an unexpected sight in a gated community in Naples, Florida. This large bear roaming through the neighborhood Sunday. The bear went into some people's yards, right up to garages, and generally seemed to be just looking around. A few other bears have also been seen in the Naples area in the past month or so. Look at the size of him. That would definitely freak you out. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of CBN News Watch. Remember, you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News Channel anytime or online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen, and you can do that by emailing newswatch@cbn.com or talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.